exciting and I hope a very, very controversial debate. I know you've all been searched outside to ensure that you haven't got rotten tomatoes. And,
just throw money.
what I'm going to do is, the plan of attack is that originally we were going to ask for written questions, and I think one person has actually given a written question. So instead I'm going to invite questions from the floor after you've heard the protagonist speak. And I think that's the best way. But first of all, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Michael Fabricant, and I am the Member of Parliament for Lichfield. And on my left, but not necessarily politically, is Professor Peter Stiles. Now, he's a professor at the University of Kiel, and he's Professor of Applied and Environmental Geophysics. And he's been teaching environmental geophysics for 35 years. I don't know whether any of you remember Round the Horn. They always used to say, 35 years.
Feels like more.
Yeah. He's a distinguished invited lecturer with the EAGE, giving a global course, and he's underpinned by a new book, Environmental Geophysics, everything you wanted to know but were afraid to ask. Do you actually have copies of your book?
No, I wouldn't.
Are you going to do a book signing?
No. Well, if you've got a copy, I'll sign it.
President of the Geological Society of London from 2003 to 2006. He's chaired DEFRA committees. He's a member of the Royal Society Committee on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Geosphere Characterization Panel of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. I thought I read that rather well. Author of the DEC report on induced seismicity associated with shale gas hydrofracturing in the UK. Do you think HS2 is bad? You wait till we get the shale extraction just outside. On my immediate right is Phil Good, who is from the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, CPRE, in Staffordshire, and is their technical advisor. Born and bred in Staffordshire, Phil lives in the south of the county, in Stafford, and started his working life with the South Staffordshire Waterworks Company. Following a spell with a firm of architects, he worked with Suffolk and Staffordshire County Councils, becoming a chartered town planner and landscape architect. And on retirement, he joined the CPRE Staffordshire branch, and as I said, he lives in Stafford, where he built his house and moved there in 1950, with every intention of moving on, but he never did. On the other side, we have Nigel Tony. No? Right, sorry, David Rowe. Let's go to David Rowe. David Rowe, who is the Independent Environmental Projects Joint Owner Director, and he is involved with the creation of good energy. Is there such a thing as good energy? We'll find out. Originally an agricultural engineer, David founded the IEP with his brother in 1997 and is qualified as a chartered environmentalist and consulting engineer. He's committed to sustainable development and reducing carbon emissions. In the past 5.5 years, he's been responsible for taking over 20 wind energy converters, often called wind turbines. I would say always called wind turbines, but there you go, far be it from me. Through planning and for 14 installations in 11 projects. Recent projects involve facilitating the installation of Enercon generators of below 1, not milliwatt, megawatt should be a capital then. Who wrote this? They obviously know nothing about engineering. Megawatt capacity for private landowners and a community project. By the way, I've got very strong views on this. So, and I'm a chartered engineer and a fellow of what used to be called the Institution of Electrical Engineers, but I decided I'd be chairman, so I'll try and be neutral. And finally, Nigel Tongue over here. He is from SNAP. Say no and protest. Originally originally born and bred in Castle Bromwich, Birmingham. You wouldn't be able to tell from his accent when you hear him speak. Nigel has lived in Clifton, Campville for the last 20 years. He has over 40 years' experience as an architectural consultant, and since 1987 has been self-employed, trading as Kenton Manor Architectural and Planning Services. Chairman of Clifton Campville Village Hall Management Committee for over 10 years. He's also chairman of SNAP, which is an action group recently formed to fight against proposals for a wind farm in that particular parish. However, he does have photovoltaic panels on his house, which he says is a better form of renewable energy and doesn't, if installed on a dwelling, destroy the existing landscapes of our beautiful rural areas. Okay, now the plan of attack is this. So far, I've received 3 written questions, and I will take those when we get to the question section, but then I'm going to take questions from the floor. I'm going to give 10 minutes maximum, and I'm going to give a 9-minute warning if we get to that stage. People should be free to speak if they want for only 5 minutes if they wish, but they've got a maximum of 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll take questions. So it is now my great pleasure to first of all introduce Peter Stiles and ask Peter to speak.
Thanks very much, Mike. Good morning, everybody. I'm Professor, as you've heard, very fulsome. I didn't write that fulsome introduction. Keele University, not too far up the road, in a very rural area, 600 acres of land. I'll come back to Keele, talk about it in a second, but I don't think anyone could have escaped, if they've read the news, that gas and electricity prices will rise by about 10% each in the next few weeks, perhaps even more, depending on how things go. The reason being is that we're vulnerable in terms of energy. It's hard to believe that. When I first started lecturing in 1975, it was the onset of North Sea gas. When we'd have enough gas forever. We also had coal-fired power stations, quite a lot of them at the time, for a whole load of reasons. Some of them, mostly not to do with the environment, much more to do with politics. We decided that was not the way to go, and that actually we would head towards gas. It may surprise you that we actually, despite having all that gas, we import 50% of the gas we use, and 47% of our electricity is generated from the burning of gas. And I don't know whether I don't have gas in my village as it happens, but I suspect a lot of you do. 70% of our domestic heating is from gas. But we are vulnerable, and you know where we get it? We get it from the Soviet Union. We get it from Gazprom. Gazprom is people like Berezovsky, Deripaska, Abramovich. These are all really very nice people, I'm assured. Okay? But bringing that gas from the Soviet Union has a higher carbon footprint than the actual burning of it when we get it here, because of the leakage of gas, of methane into the atmosphere. That's not energy security. Neither is bringing gas in tankers from Qatar through the Gulf of Aden, past Somali pirates, and shipping it into Milford Haven. It's only recently we've actually had the capabilities of bringing that gas on shore. And I'm not sure if you know, but we only have 12 days of gas storage. Okay. France has got 12, France has got 120, Germany's got 120. And several years recently we've been within about 2 days of switching off our major industry, because that's what happens. So you can have your gas at home, they switch off Ineos Glow, they switch off steelworks, etc. So the UK is not secure in energy. I don't know if you actually saw the report last week in the Sunday Times that Ofgem predicts that within 3 years we'll actually be having brownouts if we don't actually take some steps to ensure energy of all kinds. Okay. So it's not very cheerful in actual fact, and in some parts of the world this year CO2 levels rose to 400 parts per million. Okay. The average actually over the globe is 390 as of last Wednesday when I lectured on this to the students. It's rising by about 2 parts per million per year. Okay, it doesn't sound very much, 2 parts in a million, but most of the models that people have produced say that if we get to 450 parts, okay, we won't be able to stop the warming which is associated with that. Now, it's a lovely day today, right? everybody would like it a bit warmer, but that's not how it goes. We've had some terrible weather the last week or so. What you get is chaotic weather, because we actually have the jet streams further south in Iceland because of changes in ocean temperatures. Now, all those are to do with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So we're short of energy, we are also warming the atmosphere, whether you believe it or not. Okay? So what must we do about that? Well, two things. One of which, we must use less power. That's probably what David means by good energy. The best energy is a bit we don't actually use at all. And we can all take steps, and most of us, if we're here, probably have insulated our lofts and have got heating. But in actual fact, we need to have sources of energy which don't produce as much carbon, and we also need, if we can, to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere, because we've got a hell of a job to prevent the consequences of this. But a large report has just come out from the International Energy Agency about how difficult it is proving to actually have carbon sequestration, carbon capture and storage. We have no projects, despite the government offering £1 billion to any company that can actually prove this. No one has actually taken that prize. Okay? So what do? We need a sushi mix of energy. We need wind power. We need geothermal. We need hydroelectric. And we'll almost certainly need nuclear, but there's very little chance of that coming in the short term. And we will probably need gas. And that gas may very well be from shale in the UK. Now, wind energy is not really wind energy. Wind energy is solar energy. The winds, the atmospheric circulations, are driven by the interactions between solar heating and the oceans. So it's really another form of solar energy. And in actual fact, this western part of Europe is extremely windy. The further west you go, the windier it gets. The further up you get, the windier it gets. And it's variable, but in actual fact, averaged across the UK, there's almost no time that the wind isn't blowing somewhere. One of the fears is whether or not that supply is intermittent. Okay? And there's two kinds of energy you really need. You need base load, which means that when you come home from work and put the tea on and watch Neighbours, that they're sufficient to actually cover that peak high, which happens at around 5:30. Okay? But some of that energy is generated by very dirty sources. Rugeley Power Station, Drax Power Station. Drax produces more CO2 than Brazil. Okay? And that's only 20th in the list of the dirtiest coal-fired power stations in the world. The others are mostly in Japan and Korea. So the trick is that what you try to do, you try to substitute low carbon energy for the dirtiest part of the energy. So you try to bring on sources which have got low carbon and switch off sources which have high carbon. So coal and wind are a good example there. Okay? If you can bring wind energy into play, where you can, then you can switch off. You can actually turn down power stations. We can balance it across the grid. So we need a balance of energies. Okay? Now some places have got huge wind resource. I haven't looked here particularly, but we intend to put 2-3 megawatt wind turbines up at Keele University. We already have a vertical axis wind turbine. I've been doing work on vibrations and noise from wind turbines for the government and various other people for, well, now about 15 years. Okay? So we're going to have that. We also have significant geothermal energy, and we should be looking at that too. And at Keele, actually, we sit on 650 acres of unmined coal, for which we hope to extract the gas. And so we are looking for integrated solutions, and that has to be the answer for the UK too. That you actually look for energy everywhere, and you try to use the cleanest bits, and you try to switch off the dirtiest bits. Now that's not easy. In actual fact, replacing coal with gas, natural gas, saves about 50% of the CO2. And that's why gas is a good thing. Not as good as not having any fossil fuel burning at all, But in actual fact, the problem is not as simple as that. There is no easy answer to energy. I've been giving people essays on renewables and alternative energy sources for more than 35 years as tutorial exercises. Now, you may come and say, well, I don't want them, I don't like them, and I will change your mind on that. The aesthetics, I'm not talking about aesthetics, okay? But what I will say to you, 150 years ago, you only had energy from the energy you lived beside. If you lived next to a stream, right, you might have a water mill, okay? You might start to get steam power, right? You burn wood or coal on your fire, okay? What has changed all that is the national grid, and actually the electricity generating board, which is not no longer here, which balances out. Thanks, Mike, I'm finished now, actually. But you have to ask yourself, do you want electricity? Do you want gas for that matter? If you do, where do you think it comes from? Do you want it to come from here, where it's secure and under our control? Or do you want it to come from the Soviet Union? Do you want it to come from Qatar? Okay? Because you're exporting all of the bad bits of it. You're exporting the lack of regulation, you're exporting the environment degradation, because we don't actually want it here. Now suppose the government said, well, you can only have electricity if you live next to a source of electricity. My grandfather lived next to a pit heap because he was a miner. Okay? And part of the issue is that communities don't benefit directly. And I can understand people saying, well, this wind farm is not going to benefit me and someone's going to make a lot of money. And I think that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Communities need to be involved with this and they need to benefit from this. This is how it works elsewhere. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a vivid memory actually of flying some years ago to Hong Kong and flying over China, and it was a clear blue sky over most of China, and looking down out of the aircraft, and all I could see were power stations belching huge amounts of black smoke into the sky. By the way, before we began, you all had to put how you felt, and apparently 50% of you are pro, 50% of you are against, except for one person, and that one person is what I call a swing voter. So he is the guy that you have got to try and convert. The swing, or she, the swing voter. Okay, our next speaker is Phil Good. Phil from the campaign for the protection of rural England. Phil.
Thank you, sir. That's where I come from, CPRE, and I notice on our note paper heading we have a mission message. It says, we are working locally and nationally to protect and enhance a beautiful and thriving countryside for all to value and enjoy. So that's where I'm standing. With this particular audience, I don't need to tell you what we're trying to protect and enjoy, but I'm a Staffordshire man, who read out there all my life, and Staffordshire I think is one of the most beautiful of the lowland counties. If you draw a ring round the potteries and the Black Country and exclude them from your country.
I hope there's no one here from the potteries.
We'll talk later. Staffordshire's varied geology has resulted in its diverse landscape, and it is varied geology powered the Industrial Revolution, so we can't say too much about that. But we've got, within the boundary of Staffordshire, limestone, gritstone, uplands, heather-clad sandstone hills, we know them all, deep valleys, distant views, that's a very characteristic element of Staffordshire scene, is it not? Wide river plains. It's a pastoral dairying county. We won't talk about the current problems with dairying, but we were second only to Cheshire in our milk production not so very long ago. Historic houses and estates, extensive canal networks, and more than 100 conservation areas. Lichfield is one of them. This is what we value, and this is what we wish to conserve and enjoy, and I'm sure that will
Sorry.
You've got good vote.
be a few votes for or against. We've got a national park, of course, the Peak District, we've got Cannock Chase, AONB, and people in the north east pressing for another area of outstanding natural beauty in the Churney Valley, and I think they've got a good case. We've got 2 green belts, which local people value highly, of course, and the specific values are reflected in much of the legislation that we've got now. The national parks and access to the Countryside Act. I've underlined access to the Countryside Act because that's what we beat the big drum about. The threats to this landscape have come from many quarters. In the time I've been dealing with conservation, which is the best part of my life, we've had building expansion coming in waves, we've had farming changes, hedgerow losses, larger fields, Dutch elm disease, etc. But now we have wind farms and turbines. And I would like the case that we bid fair to lose what's taken millennia to achieve. That's our particular countryside. And the wind farms, I think, are moving us very much in that direction. Don't mistake what I say as being a NIMBY attitude. We in CPRE have led the charge for sustainability in all its many aspects. But there are 2 aspects to this energy equation. You can do one of 2 things. You can provide extra energy and try to keep up with the increasing demand, or you can conserve energy, and you find out, I think, if you do the sums, that conservation of energy is by far cheaper than making provision for extra energy. But it's extra energy that seems to be a need almost expressed, and it's what we're dealing with at the present time. And specifically, because that's the subject of our meeting this morning, wind energy. It is, I can't disagree with the previous speaker, one of several alternatives, and those alternatives aren't exclusive. We will have to have energy, if we're going to go for extra energy from these different sources: hydro energy, solar energy, and by that I'm referring to direct solar energy, tidal energy, excuse me, biomass, nuclear again, and once again, I have to agree with the previous speaker that nuclear energy, I think this is probably what he said, is one of the most important sources we've got, but in the slightly longer term. Whether it should be in the longer term is again a matter which you'll have your opinion on. Perhaps we should have acted sooner to provide the nuclear alternative to our present fossil fuel stations. But I have to circle around this. Many of these issues that I'm dealing with, and the previous speaker and other speakers are dealing with, are matters of national policy. And there we have to express ourselves in a different forum to the one we've got at the moment. I'll skip lightly over the arguments, the financial arguments against wind. We are given to understand, I choose my words cautiously, that wind power is vastly expensive and is only affordable, if affordable is the word, because it's transferred basically to the consumer, the cost. We know that it's erratic and unreliable. We know that you only receive the power when the wind blows. And we also know that there are many occasions when the wind isn't blowing, sometimes for short periods, but in many cases for longer periods. And then you're in trouble if you put too much reliance on wind power. The equations go something like this: if you haven't got wind power, you've got to make up when the wind doesn't blow by putting substitute fossil fuel, probably fossil fuel or other alternatives on stream to make up for when the wind power isn't working. So I was passed a note by a colleague of ours that apparently 1 week in September only 2% of usable energy was produced by the wind turbines. I've talked about Staffordshire particular characteristics of its landscape, but as a landscape architect coming to a debate like this, I have to sometimes re-examine what I think all the way through. What is the nature of the landscape that we appreciate or we love? It's a broad sweep, horizon to horizon, the horizontality of it. It's the predominance of nature, the trees, the woodlands, the hedges, water, trees, light. It's the peace and tranquility that it brings, the dark tones, and that may well crop up in debate. Thank you. Variations in texture, plays of light and shade, changing seasons, all these things. It needs a poet rather than me. But windmills are the very antithesis of these values. Vertical, height, 15-storey flats, or Salisbury Cathedral spire, 400 feet. These are the sort of heights you get. Out of scale, totally out of scale, nothing in landscape equals them. The sighting, their prominence, they go for the highest ground, do they not? And have a visibility for 100 square miles. There's the movement of the rotors, the colour, which is invariably white and is the most prominent quoted colour that there is in landscape, and they are industrial machinery. They are well designed, but they are well designed machines. So they're prominent, intrusive, incongruous, alien, and by their nature, they command the viewer's attention. So they render impossible quiet contemplation of the countryside. Your attention is grabbed by the wind turbines. There is no competition with them. And this is not capable of being mitigated in any worthwhile extent. They're there, and they stay there, and they command the scene. I will just read the other points that I think will come up in debate. Noise, bird and bat strikes, and now we have a news report that squirrels are likely to be affected by wind farms, but we won't go into that. Flicker and shadow movements could be debated. Property values will appear high on the list. The economic damage, and notably the economy of tourism. As much as 10% of economic growth in certain areas of the county is likely to come from tourism, and there will be not many people that will be attracted by wind farms, and there will be a lot of people that are deterred. Final concluding comment or quote: a cynic knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. I've paid within the age of cynicism where wind turbines are concerned.
I gave a little injury time there because of the distraction of my text going on. What is this life? Full of care. We have no time to stand and stare. Right, now it's the turn of David Rowe. David, you recall, is the joint owner of Independent Environmental Products. David.
Thank you. We live in a time of change, and in the recent words of the founder of Microsoft, get used to it. That was his point one for success in life. We live in a time of change. For the last 60 years, we've enjoyed electricity from fossil fuel powered stations. I come from Lincolnshire, and the people who don't want to see wind turbines never have a thought for the people in Nottinghamshire who see these power stations lined up on the Trent, providing them with their electricity. I don't think there will be anyone in this room who can put up their hand and say, I don't use electricity. So, some facts of life. We live in a time of change. We're all using electricity. Where's it going to come from? For millions of years, energy was stored and concentrated into the ground, and in a few seconds, it's burnt off in a power station for us to use. It's running out. More people want it. Population of the world is extremely high and growing, and if we try to continue using it, besides the acceleration of climate change putting us out of the picture anyway, then the stuff's going to run out. We've got to do something. 1976, a group of responsible scientists produced their blueprint for the future. They said, these are the problems coming, if we do something now, we're in trouble. Nothing happened till about 40 years later. So, as my colleague to the right has said, we are now facing inevitable climate change. It's a question of reducing it. Nuclear would provide energy. The Chinese-French consortium that were supposed to be funding new nuclear in the UK have just stepped out. So it's not on the horizon, but we need to keep going. Wind energy is prominent. A wind energy project is in for about 25 years. That's the planning permission on most wind energy projects. It is a good, accessible first step towards the low carbon economy, which is one of the few things that world governments, including our own, are agreeing on. Now, what are the wind energy basics? Excuse me being theatrical. The most important thing about a wind turbine is the width of rotor, because that determines how much wind it captures. The second most important thing is height above the ground, because that's where the wind is. Wind speed increases with distance from the ground. Energy increases almost exponentially on wind speed. So the higher you go, the significantly more energy that you get. Two recent projects I've been responsible for installing, and a third which we're currently working on, provides energy for the business that installs the project and the 3 or 4 villages which surround the site. Now, I acknowledge there's a difference between single wind turbines, which we're mostly involved in, and wind farms, which are multiple projects. Particularly with the single wind turbine, it's mostly developed by a local business or community. And something you might want to consider as a community is neutralising one of our most common complaints. 2 most common complaints. Number 1, don't want to see it. Number 2, why should somebody else get the money out of it? Well, actually, because they took the initiative, they put forward the £50,000 to £100,000 to get it through planning, and the £1.25 million to £1.5 million to put it up. I've worked for a community project where the community put their heads together, went to the landowner, said we want to put in our own wind turbine that supplies our own village, funds our own community services, will you come in on this with us? And it worked very well. I've been asked to step in today for a speaker who wasn't able to appear, who is part of a community wind project. They have their own low-carbon community. Now, people often say, what's the point in us going to all this trouble to neutralise carbon when China and India carry on burning it? China has 2 carbon-neutral cities. It is the biggest wind energy developer in the world. So, actually China also, as they put in these new power stations, leaves space for carbon capture and storage. They don't buy innovative technology, they only buy proven technology. So as soon as we've proven carbon capture and storage, we led the world into the Industrial Revolution, perhaps we can lead it into the low carbon economy, which is the next step. So once we've set the example, then the Chinese and many others will follow. Now, wind energy is an important part of the energy mix. The turbines we're mostly involved with are manufactured by a German company, Enercon. The direct drive, they have green bands fading from darker to lighter, going up into a grey coloured mast and rotors, which is comparable to the skies and clouds we often get in this country. And the nacelle is short and teardrop shaped, designed by Sir Norman Foster. It's about as nice a piece of sculpture as you can get in the countryside. Now, there are areas of countryside that are designated areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, green belts, and it is very unlikely that wind turbine projects are going to be staged in that area. In the areas between, it amounts to commercial countryside, and that wind turbines as commercial machinery go into those areas is something we shouldn't be surprised about. Get used to it. Now, any of you who have friends in South Africa, I believe it's Salisbury, the city, you may have heard the story that if you live in this quarter of the city, you get electricity on Monday. If you live in that quarter of the city, you get electricity on Tuesday, and so on. My colleague mentioned brownouts earlier. Brownouts are when the demand for electricity is less than the available supply, and you can't, thank you, the demand for electricity is greater than the available supply, and that pulls down the voltage. The network operator cannot allow voltage drops because it would damage equipment, so they switch off and you get a blackout. You don't know why, it might be a cable fault, it might simply be there wasn't enough power. Now, if your community has a local farm which put up a single wind turbine that provides for his drying plant, piggery, whatever, plus the 3 villages around it, it is very unlikely the grid operators will cut you off because they'll be losing a power source. Grid, say a little more about it. Yes, there is some intermittency with electricity, though within the nation, most of the time the wind is blowing somewhere, or the sun is shining, or there is backup from traditional nuclear. But it doesn't stop there. Many of you will have heard the story of what happens at the end of EastEnders, that everybody goes, or millions of people go switch on their kettle. And electricity is brought in from France, from Scandinavia. Power stations are wound up so that they can power the kettles that are switched on after each EastEnders. The grid is manageable and it's growing. The supergrid is being extended into the continent. Eventually we could be pulling pumped hydro from Scotland, from Scandinavia, solar from the Sahara, wind that's blowing in Eastern Europe when it's not here, via the grid. There is a concept that eventually that supergrid could come all the way back round to and from America. So balancing wind energy within the total energy mix isn't that big a problem. Thank you. When we're planning a wind energy project, first thing we do is draw circles around people's houses to get a distance according to the noise footprint of the proposed turbine, so that it's far enough away that it's not causing a noise nuisance. If it's far enough away not to cause a noise nuisance, then it's far enough away not to cause a shadow flicker nuisance. There are a number of other considerations go on. The next main one being how far do we get from hedges and trees to minimise, if not neutralise, the impact on wildlife. There's an average of something like 1 bird per year per wind turbine, compared with many, many more for motor cars. Costs, all energy is subsidised. Renewable energy, we happen to have got the information up front. Other energy, you've got to dig deeper to find the subsidy. The subsidy for wind energy, renewable energy generally, recently has been about £4 per household per year, compared with, I think it's £40 in gas and fossil fuel prices before the recent rises. 10 minutes is a short time. Thank you for your attention.
And speakers will, of course, have the opportunity to expand a little bit in answer to questions. For last but not least, Nigel Tongue from SNAP. Say no and protest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise firstly for sharing the top table here with a professor, a politician and a salesman. I'm the one that's going to give you the truth about all of this.
You better wait first to hear the
I probably have better credentials than any of the previous speakers, and therefore I'll put you in the picture. This all started with the comment CO2. What is CO2? It's an invisible gas. Without it, we don't breathe. It's not the oxygen that we rely on, it's CO2. CO2 is the thing that sparks the breath. So CO2 is very important to us. It's in the air, it's everywhere. And did you realise that more CO2 comes out the sea than what we actually produce on the land? All those animals, all the microbes in the sea are producing gases, and the CO2, far greater amount of CO2 coming out of the sea. So whoever decided that we were destroying the planet, I think they need to re-evaluate that statement. The ozone layer has been monitored for 30 years, approximately. The ozone layer has been there for millions of years. Suddenly there's a hole in it. We've made the hole. Was the hole formed from outside? Nobody knows that. Nobody sent a spaceship up to see if that hole was actually made from outside. Oh no, you've made the hole. You've produced all the CO2. Yes, we're being blamed as a society for destroying our own planet. I think if the politicians were honest, they would say that fossil fuels are finite and we have a problem producing electric. If they were honest and said that, I think we would all subscribe to some other form of producing electricity. But no, they tax CO2. Water vapour, in fact, has more of a devastating effect on the ozone layer than CO2. But they don't tax water vapour. Oh no, we've got to tax CO2. So let's get some honesty in the discussion. The discussion is we need to produce electricity. Now how are we going to do that? Renewables are missold. I've got photovoltaic cells on my roof. I was not sold them. I'm not